The billionaire CEO laughed and said, "You're claiming I'm the father." 10 years later, he saw her with twins again and begged for a reunion. "Hi, my beautiful family, Heavenly God, we lift every woman in this family into your loving hands. Cover her with strength when the world tries to break her, with peace when life becomes heavy, and with honor that no one can take away. She is the heart of love, the keeper of patience, the quiet power that builds homes, heals wounds, and carries generations forward. Bless her body with health, her mind with calm, and her soul with unshakable worth. May her days be filled with dignity, her nights with rest, and her future with hope. Let her never feel forgotten, never feel small, never feel alone, because in your eyes she is precious beyond measure. Surround her family with unity, protect her children, and reward her sacrifices with joy. Let love follow her wherever she goes, and let respect rise for her wherever she stands. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Some laughter echoes in your bones long after the sound dies, and Linda Lewis still felt the vibrations of Charles Summers' mockery in her ribs every single morning when she woke to feed her daughters. Linda stood in the penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, her hands trembling as she clutched the ultrasound images. 3 months pregnant and terrified, but she had convinced herself that Charles would understand, that what they shared meant something beyond late nights in his private office. She had been his executive assistant for 2 years, the woman who knew his schedule better than he did, who had fallen in love with him during the merger negotiations that would make him the youngest billionaire CEO in tech innovation. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and she watched his face transform from confusion to something cold and cutting that made her stomach drop. Charles leaned back in his leather chair, and then he laughed. Not a small chuckle or nervous sound, but a full, mocking laugh that filled the enormous office and seemed to bounce off every glass surface. His legal team, 3 men in expensive suits reviewing contracts at the conference table, looked up with barely concealed smirks. The sound of that laughter would haunt Linda for years, would wake her in the middle of the night covered in sweat, would echo in her ears during moments when she thought she had finally moved past the humiliation. "You're claiming I'm the father," Charles said, still laughing, shaking his head. "Linda, I expected better from you. This is pathetic even by gold-digger standards." "Charles, please," Linda said, stepping forward with the ultrasound images extended like an offering. "We've been together for months. You know this is real. You know me." "I know that we used protection every single time," Charles said, his voice turning sharp and brutal. "I know that you're probably not even sure who the father is, and you picked me because I have money. Did you think I was stupid enough to fall for this?" Linda felt something crack inside her chest, some fundamental belief she had held about the world and about Charles Summers specifically. She had watched him be ruthless in business, had seen him dismantle competitors, but she had never imagined that coldness directed at her, at their child, at the truth she was speaking. "I would never lie about this," she said, and she hated how her voice broke, how tears started streaming down her face. "Charles, I came to you because this is your baby, our baby. I'm not asking for anything except acknowledgement." Charles stood up, and the sheer size of him, the power he radiated in his custom suit and his certainty, made Linda take an involuntary step backward. He walked around his desk and looked at her with something close to disgust. "Security," he said into his phone, not breaking eye contact with Linda. "I need an escort to remove someone from my office. Also get legal up here immediately." "Charles, please," Linda whispered, but he turned away from her as if she had already ceased to exist. The next hour became a blur of humiliation that would replay in Linda's mind with crystal clarity for years. Security guards appeared, treating her like a threat. Charles's lawyers arrived with papers already prepared, and they informed her that she was being accused of attempted extortion and corporate espionage. They told her that if she ever contacted Charles Summers again, if she ever repeated her claims publicly, they would destroy her so completely that she would never work in any professional capacity again. One lawyer, a woman with steel-grey hair and eyes like chips of ice, leaned close to Linda and whispered, "We've seen your type before. You're just another woman who thought she could trap a billionaire with a pregnancy scare. It won't work!" Linda wanted to scream, wanted to show them the ultrasound images she still clutched, wanted to make them understand that she was telling the truth, but the words died in her throat. Security escorted her to the elevator, and the last thing she saw before the doors closed was Charles standing at his office window, his back to her, already moving on with his day. What Linda didn't tell them in that moment, what she kept locked behind her teeth, even as security deposited her on the street with her belongings in a cardboard box, was something that made Charles's cruelty even more devastating. She knew about his medical history because she had accidentally seen the confidential file during executive physical scheduling. Charles had been told years ago that a severe childhood illness had left him with extremely low fertility, that natural conception was highly unlikely. His cruelty wasn't just rejection, it was rooted in his absolute belief that she must be lying because he genuinely thought he couldn't father children. Linda stood on the sidewalk outside Summers Technology headquarters with her cardboard box, watching people in business attire walk past her without a second glance, and she felt something inside her shift permanently. The woman who had believed in love and fairness began to die right there on that concrete, replaced by someone harder, someone who understood that the world didn't reward honesty or vulnerability, someone who would never again trust a man's words over her own survival instinct. She took a bus to the only place she could afford, a women's shelter on the outskirts of the city that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. The intake counselor, a tired woman with kind eyes, asked Linda if she had anywhere else to go. Linda shook her head, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She spent that first night in a narrow cot surrounded by other women's quiet crying, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The next morning, Linda went to a free clinic and requested another ultrasound. The technician, a young woman with gentle hands, moved the wand across Linda's belly and then paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Did you know you're carrying twins?" she asked, turning the screen toward Linda. Linda stared at the two tiny forms, two heartbeats pulsing on the monitor, and something fierce and protective rose up inside her chest. Two babies, two daughters she somehow knew instinctively. Two lives that Charles Summers had thrown away with his laughter and his cruelty and his absolute certainty that she was lying. She left the clinic with new ultrasound images, and instead of feeling overwhelmed by the impossibility of raising two children alone, she felt something unexpected: clarity, purpose, rage that burned so cold it felt like ice in her veins. She walked to the shelter bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and stared at those ultrasound images until they blurred through her tears. Linda Lewis whispered to the images of her unborn daughters a promise that would shape everything that came after, a vow that would transform her from a broken woman into something Charles Summers would never see coming. "I will make you so extraordinary that one day he'll see you from a distance and know exactly what he threw away without me ever having to say a single word. I will build an empire on the ashes of his mockery, and you will never, ever know what it feels like to beg someone to believe you." Chapter 2. The Vanishing and the Calculated Erasure. Linda didn't just disappear from the city. She orchestrated her own erasure with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival required becoming invisible to the people who wanted to destroy her. She sold everything she owned in a series of quick, desperate transactions that left her with barely enough money to survive. Her laptop, her phone, her professional wardrobe, the jewelry she had purchased during better times, even the few pieces of furniture in her small apartment, all went to pawn shops and second-hand dealers who paid a fraction of their worth. She kept only what fit in 2 suitcases and a backpack, and she used the money to buy a bus ticket to a small coastal town 8 hours away, a place she had visited once during college and remembered as quiet and unremarkable, exactly what she needed. The town was called Harbour View, though there was barely any harbour to view. just a grey stretch of beach and a collection of houses that looked tired in the perpetual ocean wind. Linda arrived with her suitcases and her growing belly and the kind of exhaustion that came from crying until there were no tears left, only a hollow ache that filled every part of her body. She found work at a 24-hour diner called Sal's, a place that smelled like burnt coffee and fried eggs, and had cracked vinyl booths that had probably been there since the place opened decades ago. The owner, a woman named Beatrice with iron-grey hair, pulled into a severe bun, and eyes that saw more than she said, looked at Linda's pregnant belly and her desperate expression, and hired her on the spot without asking too many questions. "You running from something?" Beatrice asked, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "Yes," Linda said, because lying felt pointless when the truth was written all over her face. "Good," Beatrice said. "I don't need details. I need someone who'll show up on time and work hard. You look like you need the work, and I need the help. We understand each other?" Linda nodded, and something about Beatrice's no-nonsense approach, the way she didn't pry or judge or offer false comfort, made her feel safer than she had in weeks. Beatrice offered Linda the storage room in the back of the diner, a space barely large enough for a cot and a hot plate, but it was warm and dry, and most importantly, it was free. Linda moved in that same day, hanging her few clothes on hooks screwed into the wall and trying not to think about the penthouse apartment she used to visit, the one with heated floors and a view of the entire city. The work at the diner was brutal in a way that Linda's previous job had never been. Her feet swelled in cheap sneakers, her back ached from carrying trays, her hands cracked from constant washing and the harsh chemicals used to clean tables. But there was something almost meditative about the repetitive tasks, something that kept her mind from spiraling into the darkness that waited at the edges of her consciousness. She served coffee to fishermen who came in before dawn. She made small talk with elderly couples who ordered the same meals every morning. She cleaned up after drunk teenagers who stumbled in after midnight, and she saved every single dollar she could, hiding cash in an envelope taped to the underside of her cot. But Linda wasn't just surviving, she was studying. During her breaks, during the slow hours between lunch and dinner rushes, during the nights when she couldn't sleep because the babies kicked and her mind raced, Linda watched the people who came through that diner with the intensity of someone taking notes for an exam that would determine her entire future. She watched the wealthy tourists who stopped in on their way to vacation homes up the coast, the way they spoke to servers with casual dismissiveness, the way they left generous tips as if money meant nothing, the way they carried themselves with the unshakable confidence of people who had never doubted their place in the world. She memorized their speech patterns, their body language, their casual references to investments and properties and opportunities. She taught herself to recognize expensive fabrics and designer labels. She learned the difference between real confidence and performed arrogance. The diner became her classroom, and every customer became a lesson in how power operated in the world. Linda realized that Charles's cruelty hadn't just come from individual malice. It came from a system that taught people like him that they were entitled to treat people like her as disposable. Understanding that system, learning its rules and its language and its unspoken codes, became her obsession. Beatrice noticed Linda's intensity, the way she studied customers instead of just serving them, the way she asked questions about the local business owners and the summer residents and the people who seemed to have money but spent it differently than others. One slow afternoon, Beatrice sat across from Linda in a back booth and pushed a stack of business books across the table, books with worn covers and highlighted passages. "My late husband thought he was going to be the next big restaurant mogul," Beatrice said. "He bought all these books about business strategy and management theory. Never did open that second location before he died, but the books are still good. You strike me as someone who's planning something. Don't know what, don't need to know, but if you're going to plan, might as well learn from people who succeeded." Linda looked at the stack of books, titles about negotiation and market analysis and competitive strategy, and felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in weeks. Not from sadness, but from the unexpected kindness of this stranger who saw something in her worth nurturing. "Thank you," Linda whispered. "Don't thank me," Beatrice said. "Just don't waste the opportunity. Whatever you're running from, make sure you're running towards something too." Linda devoured those books during her pregnancy, reading late into the night by the single bare bulb in her storage room, highlighting passages and making notes in the margins with a determination that bordered on obsessive. She taught herself basic accounting principles. She learned about market segmentation and value propositions. She studied case studies of companies that had disrupted established industries. And slowly, carefully, she began to form a plan that was equal parts revenge and resurrection. She went into labor during the breakfast rush on a Tuesday morning. Her water broke while she was carrying a tray of pancakes to a table of contractors, and the sudden gush of fluid and the crushing pain that followed made her drop the tray with a crash that silenced the entire diner. Beatrice took one look at Linda's face and called an ambulance, then climbed into the back with her, holding her hand while Linda screamed through contractions that felt like her body was tearing apart. The rural hospital was small and understaffed, and the delivery was complicated by the fact that Linda was carrying twins. The labor lasted 14 hours, a blur of pain and exhaustion, and nurses with tired faces who encouraged her to push, to breathe, to hold on just a little longer. Beatrice stayed the entire time, never leaving Linda's side, becoming the mother and sister and friend that Linda had lost when she disappeared from her old life. When the first baby was born, a tiny girl with a powerful cry and Charles Summers' exact nose, Linda felt something break open inside her chest. When the second baby arrived minutes later, another daughter with the same determined expression, Linda understood that her life had fundamentally divided into before and after this moment. The nurse asked for the father's information for the birth certificates, and Linda heard herself say something that shocked her, even as the words left her mouth. "He's dead." It was easier than explaining the truth, easier than writing Charles Summers' name on legal documents that might someday be traced back to him, easier than admitting that the father of her daughters had laughed at their existence and called her a liar and a con artist. Saying he was dead felt true in a way that mattered more than facts. The man she had loved, the man she had believed Charles Summers could be, had never existed at all. Linda named her daughters Violet and Iris, after flowers that bloomed in impossible conditions, flowers that thrived in harsh climates and rocky soil, flowers that were beautiful precisely because they survived what should have killed them. She held both babies against her chest in the hospital bed, feeling their tiny heartbeats against her skin, and she made the same promise she had made in the shelter bathroom, but this time with absolute conviction. The woman who had begged Charles Summers for acknowledgement died in that delivery room. Someone new was born alongside Violet and Iris, someone harder and hungrier and more dangerous than Charles would ever anticipate. Linda looked at her newborn daughters and promised them an empire built on the ruins of the man who tried to destroy their mother. Chapter 3. The chess game that started in a diner. Linda returned to work at the diner exactly 2 weeks after giving birth, her body still aching and her mind foggy from sleep deprivation. But Beatrice had held her job and offered to watch the twins during Linda's shifts, in exchange for nothing except the chance to hold babies again. The early months were survival in its purest form. Linda worked double shifts whenever possible, her breasts leaking milk through the cheap nursing pads she stuffed in her bra, her arms developing new muscles from carrying twins who seemed to gain weight overnight. She slept in 3-hour increments when the babies allowed it. She showered in the diner's cramped bathroom during slow periods. She ate leftover food from customer plates when no one was watching, too tired to feel shame about it. But survival wasn't enough for Linda anymore. Survival was what prey did, and she had decided in that hospital room that she would never be prey again. So even while she was serving coffee and changing diapers and operating on so little sleep that she sometimes forgot what day it was, Linda was playing a different game entirely. She noticed that Beatrice's diner was losing money, not from lack of customers, but from terrible management of inventory and supplies, food spoiled in the walk-in refrigerator, Orders were placed haphazardly without considering seasonal price fluctuations. The vendor who supplied produce was charging premium prices for mediocre quality. Linda saw all of this because she had spent 2 years as an executive assistant, managing schedules and budgets and logistics for a man who had built a tech empire, and those skills didn't disappear just because her circumstances had changed. During her break one afternoon, Linda created a handwritten inventory system using nothing but notebook paper and a pencil. She tracked every item that came into the diner, every plate that went out, every dollar spent and earned. She calculated waste percentages and identified patterns that revealed where money was bleeding away invisibly. After 2 weeks of meticulous documentation, she presented her findings to Beatrice with a simple proposal. "You're losing nearly 40% of your potential profit to waste and poor vendor management," Linda said, spreading her handwritten charts across the counter during the dead hour between lunch and dinner. "If you let me restructure your ordering system and find better suppliers, I can cut that waste in half within a month. I don't want a raise, I just want you to tell other business owners about what I did here." Beatrice studied the charts with narrowed eyes, and Linda watched her process the information, saw the moment when the older woman realized that her diner could be making significantly more money with just a few changes. Beatrice looked at Linda with new assessment, seeing past the exhausted young mother to the intelligence and capability that had always been there. "You're too smart to be working in my diner," Beatrice said finally. "Right now I need your diner," Linda replied, "but not forever." Beatrice agreed to Linda's proposal, and within a month, the diner's profit margins improved exactly as Linda had predicted. Beatrice kept her word and told other small business owners in Harborview about the young woman who had transformed her operations. Linda started getting requests from local shops and restaurants to analyze their inventory systems and supplier relationships. She did the work during late nights after her shifts and during the brief windows when the twins were sleeping, and she charged modest fees that business owners could afford, but that added up faster than her diner wages ever had. Linda was also working a second job that no one knew about. She had gotten herself hired as a night cleaner at a commercial office building where several investment firms and law practices kept offices. The job paid minimum wage and required her to work from midnight until dawn, but it gave her something more valuable than money: access. While she emptied trash bins and vacuumed floors, Linda read every document left on desks and conference room tables. She studied legal briefs and investment portfolios and business proposals. She learned how real estate deals were structured. She saw how wealthy people moved their money and protected their assets. She memorized the names of property managers and venture capitalists and attorneys who specialized in business formation. She was essentially getting a graduate-level education in wealth building by reading other people's confidential documents, and no one suspected the night cleaner with 2 babies at home was cataloging their business strategies. One night, while cleaning the conference room of a small investment firm, Linda found a proposal for a real estate development deal that was being finalized. The property was a rundown commercial building on the edge of town that was being sold for a fraction of its potential value because the current owner was desperate to liquidate. The proposal outlined how the building could be renovated and leased to tech companies looking for affordable satellite offices outside major cities. The numbers were compelling, showing potential returns that made Linda's hands tremble as she read. She made a copy of the proposal on the office photocopier, took it home, and spent the next week analyzing every detail. She had saved nearly $5,000 from her various jobs, money she had planned to use as a safety cushion, but this opportunity felt like the break she had been waiting for. The minimum investment to buy into the deal was $2,000, a ridiculously small amount that told Linda the investment firm was having trouble finding investors who believed in the project. Linda made a decision that terrified her. She contacted the investment firm, presented herself as a potential investor, and negotiated to buy a stake in the property using nearly half of her savings. The firm was surprised that a diner waitress wanted to invest, but desperate enough for capital that they accepted her money. Linda signed documents she barely understood, praying that she had read the situation correctly, that this wasn't just her throwing away the only financial security she had. The twins were almost 2 years old when that investment paid off. The property was renovated and leased to a technology startup that needed space immediately. The value of the building tripled. Linda's $2,000 investment turned into $15,000 when the property was sold to a larger developer. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than Linda had ever had at one time. And more importantly, it was proof that she could read markets and opportunities correctly. She used that $15,000 to buy used computer equipment and pay for online courses in software development and business management. She taught herself to code during the handful of hours when the twins were sleeping, her eyes burning from staring at a laptop screen in the dimly lit storage room, her fingers cramping from typing while sitting on her narrow cot. The coding came naturally to her, the logic and structure appealing to the same part of her brain that had made her excel at organizing Charles's complicated schedule and managing his business logistics. When Violet and Iris started preschool, Linda got her break into professional work through an unexpected connection. One of the twins' classmates was the daughter of a woman named Jasmine Wu, who worked for her father's venture capital firm that funded early-stage technology companies. Jasmine came to pick up her daughter one afternoon and struck up a conversation with Linda about the challenges of balancing work and motherhood. During their conversation, Linda mentioned in passing that she had created inventory management systems for several local businesses and was teaching herself software development. Jasmine's interest sharpened immediately. Her father's firm had invested in several small companies that were struggling with exactly that problem. They needed custom inventory and operations software, but couldn't afford enterprise solutions or dedicated development teams. "Would you be interested in consulting work?" Jasmine asked. "Our portfolio companies need someone who understands both business operations and technology. Most developers don't understand the business side, and most business consultants don't understand the technology." Linda felt her heart race, but kept her voice steady. "I'd be very interested. What kind of compensation structure are you thinking? What if instead of salary, we offered you equity in the companies you help?" Jasmine proposed. "Small percentages, but if any of them succeed, you'd see significant returns. It's risky, but you strike me as someone who understands strategic risk." Linda agreed immediately, understanding that this was exactly the kind of opportunity that could transform her trajectory. She started consulting for the portfolio companies, working during every spare moment, building custom software solutions that were simpler and more intuitive than anything available on the market. She took equity stakes instead of cash payment, betting on her ability to help these struggling companies succeed. The work was exhausting. Linda was operating on minimal sleep, balancing her consulting work with part-time shifts at the diner because she still needed immediate income to feed her daughters. Violet and Iris grew up watching their mother work until dawn, fell asleep with her laptop balanced on their bed, woke up to find their mother already coding before breakfast. They learned to be independent earlier than most children, making their own simple meals and entertaining themselves, while Linda's attention was consumed by work that would determine their future. When the twins turned 5, 2 of the companies Linda had helped went through acquisition deals. Her small equity stakes suddenly became real money, nearly $400,000 total. Linda sat in the bank office, signing documents that transferred that money into her account, and she felt dizzy with the realization that she had just earned more than Charles Summers had paid her in 2 years of working as his assistant. She used that money to start her own company, registering the business name with deliberate intent, Bloom Technologies. The name was both a promise to her daughters and a message to Charles Summers that he would someday hear and wonder if it could possibly be the woman he had destroyed. Linda built the company with singular focus, targeting the exact market sector where Charles's company dominated, enterprise resource management systems for mid-sized businesses. But she did it differently, building technology that was accessible and affordable instead of exclusive and expensive, serving the customers that Charles ignored as too small to matter. Bloom Technologies grew quickly because Linda understood something fundamental about business that Charles never had. Success wasn't about dominating everyone. It was about serving the people others overlooked. She hired developers who were talented but had been rejected by larger firms. She offered equity to early employees, building loyalty through shared investment. She created a company culture that was the opposite of everything Charles Summers represented. The twins watched their mother transform from exhausted waitress to confident CEO. They attended business meetings with Linda when childcare fell through, doing homework in conference rooms while their mother negotiated deals. They learned business strategy alongside multiplication tables. They absorbed lessons about negotiation and risk assessment the way other children absorbed cartoons. Violet developed a sharp, analytical mind that could spot flaws in proposals. Iris became skilled at reading people's intentions and emotional states. They were exceptional students and confident girls who had no idea their mother's drive was fueled by ancient rage that still burned cold and steady beneath everything she built. When Bloom Technologies reached a valuation of $400 million, Linda received an invitation that made her hands shake when she opened the envelope. The Tech Innovators Summit, the industry's most prestigious conference, was requesting her presence as a featured speaker. Charles Summers was listed as the keynote speaker. Linda stared at that invitation for a long time, and she realized with perfect clarity that the past 10 years had been building toward this exact moment. Chapter 4. The Empire Built on Strategic Revenge. Linda stood in front of her closet in the home she had purchased with money she earned, staring at rows of designer suits and dresses that cost more than she used to make in months. And she felt nothing except cold calculation about what would make the most devastating impression. The house itself was a testament to how far she had come. It sat on 3 acres overlooking the ocean, with floor-to-ceiling windows and hardwood floors, and a kitchen where Violet and Iris did their homework at a marble island while Linda made dinner from scratch because she never wanted them to forget what it felt like when having enough food wasn't guaranteed. The house was beautiful but not ostentatious, expensive but not showy, exactly like the image Linda had cultivated for herself and her company. Bloom Technologies had grown from a one-woman operation into a company with over 200 employees and contracts with major corporations that needed better inventory and resource management systems. Linda had deliberately built the company to compete directly with Charles Summers' technology empire, targeting the same market sector with superior products at lower prices. She had studied his company's weaknesses for years, identifying the gaps in his service model, the customers he neglected, the innovations he was too arrogant to pursue. Every decision she made about Bloom Technologies was strategic, calculated to position her company as the emerging competitor that would eventually challenge Summers Tech Group's dominance. But the competition wasn't just about business success. Linda had built Bloom Technologies with the specific goal of forcing Charles to eventually notice her, to hear her name in industry contexts, to wonder if it could possibly be the same Linda Lewis he had thrown out of his office. She wanted him to know she existed and succeeded, but only after she had become powerful enough that he couldn't touch her, couldn't dismiss her, couldn't make her disappear the way he had tried to before. The Tech Innovators Summit was the perfect stage for their reunion because it was public, professional, and completely on Linda's terms. She had achieved the exact position she needed, successful enough to be undeniable, wealthy enough to be untouchable, powerful enough to face him as an equal rather than as the desperate woman who had begged for his acknowledgement. Linda selected a midnight blue suit that was tailored perfectly to her body, expensive without being obvious about it, powerful without being aggressive. She chose jewelry that was elegant and understated, the kind that wealthy people recognized as expensive precisely because it didn't advertise. She spent hours with her hair and makeup, not to look beautiful for Charles, but to look like the successful CEO she had become, someone he would need a moment to recognize because she was so completely transformed from the woman he remembered. But Linda's most strategic decision was bringing Violet and Iris to the summit with her. The twins were 10 years old now, tall for their age and striking in ways that made strangers do double takes. They had Charles's bone structure, his distinctive features, his presence. Violet had inherited his analytical intensity, the way his mind worked through problems with laser focus. Iris had his charisma, the natural confidence that made people want to follow her lead. They were extraordinary children who excelled at everything they attempted, and Linda knew with absolute certainty that if Charles saw them, he would recognize himself in their faces immediately. Linda had never told Violet and Iris about their father. She had constructed a careful story about him being someone from her past who had died before they were born, a lie that protected them from the truth of their rejection and protected Linda from having to explain why she had raised them alone. The twins had asked questions over the years, naturally curious about the absent parent, but they had also watched their mother build an empire with her own hands and seemed satisfied with the knowledge that they came from strength, even if one half of their DNA was a mystery. "Why are we going to this conference?" Iris asked, while Linda helped her get dressed in the hotel room the morning of the summit. "You usually go to boring business things alone." "Because I want you to see what I built," Linda said, which was true, but not the complete truth. "I want you to understand the industry and the work that goes into creating something meaningful. You're old enough to start learning about business strategy in real contexts." "Is this about the company that competes with Bloom?" Violet asked, perceptive as always. "I saw the conference program. Summers Tech Group is the major sponsor." Linda met her daughter's eyes in the mirror and made a decision to give them more truth than usual. "Yes, the CEO of Summers Tech is speaking today. He's someone I used to know a long time ago before you were born. Seeing him now after everything I've built matters to me. I want him to see what I became." "Did he hurt you?" Iris asked, and her voice had an edge that reminded Linda that her daughters were protective of her in ways that both warmed and wounded her heart. "Yes," Linda said simply, "but I'm not the same person he hurt, and that's what I want him to understand." The twins processed this information with the maturity that came from being raised by a single mother who had always treated them as capable of handling complex truths. They dressed in coordinating outfits that Linda had carefully selected, looking polished and confident and undeniably like miniature versions of Charles Summers in ways that would be impossible to miss. The summit took place in a massive convention center downtown, filled with technology executives and investors and journalists who covered the industry. Linda walked through the main entrance with Violet and Iris on either side of her, and she felt eyes tracking them, people recognizing her from business publications, industry leaders wanting to network with the CEO whose company was disrupting the established market. She was no longer invisible. She was someone who mattered, someone whose presence commanded attention and respect. The keynote speech was scheduled for mid-morning, and Linda made sure to arrive early enough to secure seats in the VIP section where Charles would definitely see them. She sat between her daughters, perfectly composed, watching the room fill with hundreds of people who had come to hear Charles Summers talk about innovation and disruption and the future of technology. When Charles walked onto the stage, Linda felt her heart rate spike for the first time in years. He looked older, more polished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her first car. His hair had threads of silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than aged. He commanded the stage with easy confidence, his voice carrying to the back of the enormous room without strain, his presence magnetic in the way that made people lean forward and pay attention. Linda watched him deliver his prepared remarks about technological innovation and market transformation, and she felt absolutely nothing except cold satisfaction. This was the man she had loved, the man who had destroyed her, the man who had laughed at the truth and called her a liar. He stood on that stage as a symbol of success and vision, and no one in that room except Linda knew that he had thrown away his own children because he was too arrogant to believe he could be wrong. Then, midway through his speech, Charles looked directly at Linda. She saw the exact moment when recognition hit him, when his brain processed the impossibility of seeing her here, in this context, in the VIP section where only the most successful industry leaders sat. His voice faltered, He lost his train of thought for several seconds, recovering awkwardly while the audience shifted in confusion. His eyes moved from Linda to Violet, then to Iris, and Linda watched his face transform as he did the math, as he saw his own features reflected in two 10-year-old girls who couldn't possibly exist according to the story he had told himself. The rest of his speech was a disaster. Charles stumbled through his remaining points, clearly distracted, checking the VIP section repeatedly as if Linda might disappear if he looked away. The tech journalists in attendance noticed his unusual performance, several of them typing notes on their laptops about the uncharacteristic stumbling of the usually polished CEO. When the speech ended and Charles left the stage to polite but confused applause, Linda knew he would come looking for her. She was ready for him, had been preparing for this confrontation for 10 years, and she intended to destroy him with nothing more than the truth of what she had become. Chapter 5. The public destruction he never saw coming. Charles found Linda in the networking reception after his keynote, and she watched him approach with the same predatory focus she had seen him use in business negotiations, the look of a man who intended to get what he wanted through sheer force of will. Linda stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Violet and Iris beside her, looking at their phones with the practiced boredom of children who had attended too many adult business functions. She saw Charles pushing through the crowd of executives who wanted to speak with him, saw the desperation in his face that was barely concealed beneath his professional mask, and she felt a surge of power so intense it was almost physical. "Linda," Charles said when he reached her, and his voice carried too much emotion for a professional setting, too much shock and confusion, and something that might have been hope. "I didn't expect to see you here." Linda turned to face him with perfect composure, letting him see her expensive suit, her confidence, the complete transformation from the desperate woman he remembered. She extended her hand for a formal handshake, keeping her voice professionally cool. "Charles, it's been quite a while. I'm Linda Lewis, CEO of Bloom Technologies. I don't believe you've had the pleasure of being introduced to my daughters, Violet and Iris." The formality of her introduction was deliberate, treating him like any other industry colleague, rather than acknowledging their history. Charles looked at the twins, and Linda watched his face cycle through shock, recognition, and something close to physical pain as he understood what he was seeing. Violet and Iris looked up from their phones, polite but uninterested, treating Charles like any other boring adult at one of their mother's work events. "Hello," Violet said with practiced courtesy. "Nice to meet you," Iris added, already looking back at her phone. Charles seemed unable to form words for several long seconds, and the silence stretched awkwardly while other executives nearby started to notice the tension. Linda let him struggle, offering no help, no warmth, no acknowledgement of anything beyond professional courtesy. "Bloom Technologies?" Charles finally managed. "You're the CEO of the company that's been acquiring our mid-market clients?" "That's correct," Linda said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the cluster of executives pretending not to listen nearby. "I built Bloom from the ground up about 8 years ago, focusing on providing enterprise solutions to businesses that larger companies like Summers Tech tend to overlook as unprofitable. It's been quite successful. We're currently valued at just over 400 million and growing rapidly." The number was deliberately mentioned, letting Charles and everyone within earshot understand that Linda wasn't just successful, she was wealthy, powerful, and a legitimate competitor. Charles's face went through another series of emotions, landing on something that looked like anger mixed with disbelief. "I need to speak with you privately," Charles said, his voice dropping lower, more urgent. "About a personal matter." Linda smiled, and the smile was sharp enough to cut. "I'm afraid I don't have anything personal to discuss with you, Charles. We're industry colleagues now, nothing more, though I do appreciate the lessons I learned from working at Summers Tech all those years ago. You taught me exactly the kind of business leader I never wanted to become." The comment landed like a physical blow, and several of the nearby executives couldn't hide their interest anymore, moving slightly closer to hear what was becoming clear was not a friendly reunion. Linda saw the tech journalist from a major publication recording this interaction on her phone, and she felt satisfaction knowing that whatever happened next would be documented and discussed. Charles tried to recover his composure, but his hands were shaking slightly, his professional mask cracking in ways Linda had never seen during the years she worked for him. "Linda, please. I saw your daughters. I need to understand." "My daughters are none of your concern," Linda interrupted, her voice still perfectly controlled, but with an edge that made Charles step back. "They're my family, my responsibility, and my greatest achievement. I built a life and a company that gives them every opportunity, and I did it completely on my own. That's all you need to understand. But they look like me," Linda finished. "Yes, they do. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a panel discussion to prepare for. It was interesting seeing you again, Charles. I hope you enjoyed the keynote. You seemed a bit distracted during the second half." She turned to leave, placing her hands on her daughter's shoulders to guide them away. But Charles made the catastrophic mistake of reaching out and grabbing Linda's arm. The touch was desperate, not aggressive, but Violet and Iris both turned immediately, their bodies tensing in a protective stance they had learned from watching their mother navigate the world as a single woman with something to lose. "Don't touch her," Violet said, her voice carrying a warning that seemed far too mature for a 10-year-old. Charles dropped his hand as if burned, and Linda saw several security guards start moving toward their location, responding to the obvious tension. She also saw the journalist's phone still recording, capturing every moment of Charles Summers, the powerful billionaire CEO, losing control in a public setting. Linda leaned closer to Charles, her voice low enough that only he could hear over the noise of the crowded reception. "You threw me out of your office when I needed you most. You called me a liar and threatened to destroy my career. You laughed at me, Charles. I heard that laughter every single day for years, while I worked 3 jobs to survive, while I lived in a shelter, while I gave birth to your daughters alone in a rural hospital with nobody but a diner owner holding my hand. I built everything you see without you, despite you, because of you. I don't need your acknowledgement now. I don't need your guilt or your curiosity or whatever you think you owe me. I already won by becoming someone who doesn't need anything from you at all." She straightened up and spoke in her normal voice, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "It really was lovely seeing you again. Best of luck with your keynote sessions. I hear the market is becoming quite competitive in your sector. Innovation moves fast." Linda walked away with Violet and Iris, leaving Charles standing alone in a circle of executives who had witnessed the entire interaction and were already forming theories about what had just happened. She felt their eyes on her back, felt the weight of speculation and gossip that would follow, and she didn't care at all because she had just done what she had spent 10 years preparing to do. She had stood in front of Charles Summers as an equal, showed him exactly what he had thrown away, and walked away from him the same way he had once walked away from her, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge of his own failure. The tech blogs published articles within hours. "Summers Tech CEO has awkward public encounter with competitor," read one headline. "Who is Linda Lewis and why did her presence derail Charles Summers' keynote?" asked another. The speculation ranged from business rivalry to romantic history, and none of the articles had the full story, but all of them made Charles look unprofessional, unstable, and distracted. Linda read them in her hotel room that night while Violet and Iris slept in the adjoining room, and she felt the satisfaction of a decade-long plan executing exactly as intended. Charles Summers now knew she existed and succeeded. He knew about his daughters, and most importantly, he knew that Linda Lewis had become someone far more powerful than the woman he destroyed, someone who could hurt him without ever raising her voice or breaking a law or doing anything except succeeding spectacularly in the same industry where he thought he was untouchable. The reunion Linda had orchestrated wasn't about reconciliation or closure. It was about showing Charles that some people rise from the ashes stronger than they were before the fire, and the burn of that knowledge would hurt him far more than any revenge she could have designed. Chapter 6. The unraveling of a billionaire's sanity. Charles Summers returned to his penthouse office after the summit, and for the first time in his adult life, he couldn't focus on work because his mind was consumed by Linda Lewis and the two girls who had his face, his eyes, his entire genetic blueprint written across their features in ways that made denial impossible. He spent the first week after the summit trying to convince himself he was wrong, that the resemblance was coincidental, that Linda must have married someone who happened to look similar to him and those couldn't possibly be his daughters. But the math was inescapable. The twins appeared to be about 10 years old, which aligned perfectly with the timing of when Linda had come to his office claiming to be pregnant. The medical records he pulled from his private physician confirmed what he already knew. The childhood illness that had damaged his fertility meant natural conception was highly unlikely, but not impossible. Those twins were his daughters. Linda had been telling the truth. He had thrown away his own children because he was too arrogant to believe he could be wrong about his own body. The realization should have filled Charles with guilt, with remorse, with the desire to somehow make amends for his catastrophic mistake. Instead, what consumed him was rage. He was furious at Linda for not fighting harder to convince him, for not providing more proof, for hiding his children from him for an entire decade. He was furious that she had built a competing company specifically to hurt him, that she had orchestrated their reunion at the summit to humiliate him publicly, that she had transformed herself into someone powerful enough to reject him the way he had once rejected her. Charles told himself he was the victim in this situation, that Linda had wronged him by keeping his daughter's secret, that she had no right to make decisions about his children without his input. He constructed elaborate justifications for his original rejection, convincing himself that if Linda had just tried harder, if she had been more persuasive, if she had understood how the medical history made her claim seem impossible, then none of this would have happened. He blamed her for not anticipating his reaction, for not having better proof, for leaving instead of fighting. His obsession with Linda and the twins consumed him. He hired private investigators to compile comprehensive reports on Linda's life since she left Summers Tech. The reports arrived in thick folders that Charles read late at night in his office, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the woman who got away and the family he never knew existed. The investigators documented everything: the women's shelter where Linda had lived after he threw her out, sleeping on a cot among strangers, 3 months pregnant and alone. The diner where she worked double shifts while her body changed with pregnancy, saving every dollar, living in a storage room because she couldn't afford an apartment. The rural hospital where she delivered twins with only the diner owner present, no family, no partner, just a woman who had shown her kindness. The years of grinding poverty, 3 jobs, online courses, the impossible climb from nothing to something that Charles himself might not have survived. The reports showed Linda's transformation from desperate single mother to successful entrepreneur. They showed the strategic decisions she made, the risks she took, the clients she won away from Summers Tech with better technology and more attentive service. They showed that Linda had deliberately built her company to compete with his, that every success she achieved was a calculated middle finger to the man who said she was a liar trying to trap him. Charles should have felt guilt reading those reports, should have felt shame about what his cruelty cost Linda and his daughters. Instead, he felt betrayed. He convinced himself that Linda should have contacted him again over the years, should have tried to tell him about the twins' birth, should have given him a chance to be involved. He ignored the fact that his lawyers had threatened to destroy her if she ever contacted him again, that he had called her a liar and a con artist, that he had given her every reason to believe he would never acknowledge the twins even with proof. The investigators provided current information about Violet and Iris. Academic records showing they were exceptional students, extracurricular activities including piano lessons and debate team. Photos of them with Linda at school events, all 3 of them looking happy and close in ways that made Charles feel physically ill with longing for something he had never had. The reports noted that the twins had no father listed on their birth certificates, that Linda had apparently told them their father was dead, that they had grown up believing themselves fatherless when their actual father was a billionaire who could have given them anything. Charles became fixated on the idea that his daughters had been deprived of the life they deserved, that Linda had kept them from wealth and privilege and opportunities, that growing up in poverty had somehow damaged them, even though the reports clearly showed they were thriving. He convinced himself that he needed to rescue them from Linda, that his wealth and resources would improve their lives, that he deserved a relationship with them regardless of what Linda wanted. He started showing up at Bloom Technologies headquarters, demanding meetings with Linda. His assistant made formal requests through proper channels. Charles himself appeared in the lobby unannounced, insisting he needed to speak with the CEO about urgent matters. Linda refused every request, sending messages through her executive assistant that she had no interest in meeting with Charles Summers for any reason, professional or personal. The rejection infuriated Charles in ways he didn't fully understand. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence and resources. He had built an empire by refusing to accept no as an answer. But Linda was impervious to every strategy he tried. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his business connections. She didn't need anything from him, and that reality was intolerable. Charles started sending gifts to the twins, expensive toys and electronics and designer clothes, delivered to their home with cards introducing himself as a friend of their mother's who wanted to get to know them. Linda returned every single gift unopened, with notes that said simply, "Not interested. Stop contacting my family." He tried using business pressure, threatening partnerships and deals, suggesting to mutual contacts that Bloom Technologies might face difficulties if Linda continued to be unreasonable about personal matters. But Linda's company was too well established to be bullied, her client base too loyal, her reputation too solid. The business community noticed Charles's unusual obsession with a competitor, and the speculation about their history intensified. Charles's own board started questioning his judgment. His business performance had declined noticeably since the summit. He was sleeping poorly, missing meetings, making decisions that were uncharacteristically emotional rather than strategic. His mother called him after seeing the tech blog articles and asked pointed questions about the woman at the summit and why Charles seemed to be falling apart over her. Charles couldn't explain it to her or to himself. How could he admit that he had thrown away his own children and spent a decade not caring, only to suddenly become obsessed with reclaiming them once he knew they existed? His mother finally cornered him in his office after he cancelled a major investor meeting because he was too distracted to focus. She sat across from his desk, looking at her son with the disappointment only a mother could convey, and told him a truth he had been desperately avoiding. "You're not angry at Linda for hiding your children," she said. "You're angry at yourself for being exactly the kind of man who deserved to have them hidden from him. You're angry because she survived your cruelty and thrived without you, because she proved that she never needed you at all, and that terrifies you more than anything else in your life ever has." Charles wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to maintain the narrative that he was the wronged party. But sitting in his office, exhausted and obsessed and falling apart, he couldn't sustain the lie anymore. His mother was right. He wasn't angry at Linda. He was devastated by the realization that he had destroyed something precious through his own arrogance, and no amount of money or power or persistence could undo that damage. The question that haunted Charles in the weeks after the summit wasn't whether he could force Linda to give him access to his daughters. It was whether he deserved access at all, and the honest answer to that question was something he wasn't ready to face. Chapter 7. The violation that proves Linda right. Charles made the decision that would prove Linda was right about everything when he discovered that Violet and Iris were performing in their school's Spring Talent Showcase, an event that was open to the public and required no permission to attend. He told himself he just wanted to see his daughters in person, to watch them perform, to understand who they were beyond the clinical details in investigation reports. He convinced himself that attending a public event wasn't violating Linda's boundaries, that he had a right as their father to see them even if Linda disagreed. He ignored the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his mother, warning him that what he was planning was exactly the kind of boundary violation that had made Linda hide the twins in the first place. The talent showcase took place in the school auditorium on a Thursday evening. Charles arrived early and sat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous in a room full of parents with cameras and phones ready to record their children's performances. He wore casual clothes instead of his usual suit, hoping to blend in, but his presence still drew attention because he radiated wealth and power in ways that expensive casual clothing couldn't hide. When Violet walked onto the stage to perform her piano piece, Charles felt his throat close with emotion. She moved with precise confidence, sitting at the piano with perfect posture, her hands finding the keys with the kind of skill that came from years of dedicated practice. The piece she performed was complex, something by a composer Charles didn't recognize, and she played it flawlessly, her expression focused and serious in ways that reminded him of himself during high-stakes negotiations. The audience applauded enthusiastically when Violet finished, and Charles found himself on his feet, clapping harder than anyone else, tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter take a bow and leave the stage. That was his daughter. His brilliant, talented, extraordinary daughter who didn't know he existed. When Iris performed her spoken word piece, Charles was completely destroyed. She stood center stage with a microphone, her presence commanding in ways that seemed impossible for someone so young, and she performed a piece she had written herself about mothers who are superheroes. The poem detailed a mother who worked multiple jobs, who went to school while raising children, who built empires from nothing, who never gave up even when the world tried to break her. Iris spoke about sacrifice and strength and love that persisted through impossible circumstances, and every word was clearly about Linda. Charles sat in the dark auditorium sobbing, watching his daughter honor the woman he had tried to destroy, and he understood with devastating clarity what he had missed. These weren't just children, they were extraordinary human beings who had been shaped by Linda's strength and sacrifice, who had grown up watching their mother refuse to be broken, who had learned resilience and determination and loyalty from a woman who survived everything Charles threw at her. After the performances, Charles made his catastrophic mistake. He followed Violet and Iris into the hallway where families were gathering, congratulating their children, taking photos, talking about getting ice cream to celebrate. He approached the twins with a smile that he hoped looked friendly and normal, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear his own voice over the blood rushing in his ears. "Excuse me," he said, and both girls turned to look at him with polite curiosity. "I just wanted to tell you both that your performances were incredible. Violet, that piano piece was stunning, and Iris, your poem was so moving. You're both extremely talented." "Thank you," Violet said, smiling but slightly guarded, the way children are taught to be with strangers who approach them. "I'm Charles," he continued, unable to stop himself from pushing further. "I'm an old friend of your mother's. We worked together many years ago. I saw her at a conference recently and thought I'd come to see you perform since she mentioned you were in the showcase." The lie came easily, and Charles watched the twins' expressions shift from polite interest to confusion because Linda would never have mentioned this event to him, would never have invited him to attend. But before he could say anything else, before he could ask them questions about their lives or try to forge any kind of connection, Linda appeared. Charles had never seen Linda look the way she did in that moment. Her face was completely devoid of expression, her body rigid with a tension that made other parents nearby stop their conversations and turn to watch. She moved between Charles and her daughters with the protective instinct of a mother who had just identified a threat, putting her body as a physical barrier while placing her hands on both girls' shoulders. "Go wait in the car," Linda told Violet and Iris, her voice eerily calm. "Now." The twins recognized the tone, recognized that their mother was using every ounce of her control to stay composed, and they obeyed immediately without argument. Charles watched them leave, watched his daughters look back at him with confusion and something that might have been concern, and then they were gone, and Linda's full attention focused on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She didn't yell, didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. She simply looked at Charles with an expression that was colder and more terrifying than any rage could have been, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every parent in that hallway, ensuring they all heard every word. "If you ever come near my children again, without my explicit permission, I will destroy you legally, financially, and publicly. I will file restraining orders. I will contact every major news outlet about your pattern of stalking the family you abandoned. I will make sure every person in the technology industry knows exactly what kind of man you are. Do you understand me?" Charles tried to speak, tried to explain that he just wanted to see his daughters perform, that he had a right as their father, but Linda cut through every word with surgical precision. "You're not their father. You're a DNA donor who laughed when I needed you most. You're a man who threw me out of your office, threatened to destroy my career, and called me a liar when I told you the truth. You didn't want anything to do with these children when they were a terrifying responsibility. You don't get to suddenly want them now that they're extraordinary human beings that I created without you. You had your chance. You made your choice. You don't get to remake that decision just because you finally realized what you lost." The hallway had gone completely silent except for Linda's voice. Other parents had their phones out, recording the confrontation, capturing every word. Charles could see the school principal approaching with security, responding to the obvious tension. He knew he should walk away, should apologize, should acknowledge that he had violated Linda's boundaries, but his own rage finally broke through. "You kept my children from me for 10 years, he shouted, his control shattering completely. "You hid them, poisoned them against me, denied me the chance to be their father. You had no right." "I had every right," Linda interrupted, her voice still controlled even though Charles was yelling. "I had the right to protect my daughters from a man who couldn't be trusted to believe their existence. I had the right to build a life where they didn't have to beg someone to love them. I had the right to ensure they grew up knowing their worth wasn't determined by whether you decided they were real. And right now, you're proving exactly why I made the right decision by showing my daughters that you can't respect basic boundaries, that you think your wants matter more than their safety, that you're still the same arrogant man who couldn't believe a woman when she told him the truth." Security arrived and asked Charles to leave. The principal approached Linda to check if she was all right. Parents throughout the hallway stared at Charles with expressions ranging from shock to disgust, and Charles realized with sickening clarity that he had just destroyed any chance he might have had with his daughters by doing exactly what Linda had warned him not to do. He left the school in a daze, returned to his car, and sat in the parking lot while his entire world collapsed around him. Within hours, videos of the confrontation were posted on social media. Tech blogs picked up the story, connecting the dots between the summit interaction and this new incident. "Summers Tech CEO confronts former employee who claims he's father to her children," read one headline. "Pattern of stalking alleged against billionaire Charles Summers," read another. The next morning, Charles woke to messages from his board demanding an explanation, from his PR team trying to manage the crisis, from his mother telling him she was disappointed but not surprised. And in the middle of all that chaos, Charles received a message from Linda's lawyer, formally notifying him that restraining orders were being filed, and that any further attempts to contact Linda or her daughters would result in immediate legal action. Charles sat in his penthouse office, reading that legal notice, and finally understood that he had lost everything that mattered by being unable to accept that Linda had been right to protect their daughters from him all along. Chapter 8. The Daughters Who Chose Their Mother's Truth. Linda drove home from the school talent showcase with Violet and Iris sitting in the back seat, both girls uncharacteristically quiet as they processed what they had witnessed in that hallway. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, trying to control the adrenaline shaking through her body, the rage that wanted to explode now that her daughters were safe and no longer needed her to be calm. "Mom," Violet said finally, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "That man who talked to us at school. He's not really your old co-worker, is he?" Linda took a deep breath, then another, buying herself time to figure out how to explain something she had spent 10 years trying to avoid explaining. She pulled into their driveway, turned off the car, and turned in her seat to look at her daughters directly. "No," she said simply. "He's not. Come inside. We need to talk, and I need to tell you the truth about something I've been protecting you from since you were born." They sat in the living room, Linda on one couch and the twins together on the other, and Linda told them everything. She told them about working for Charles Summers, about falling in love with him, about getting pregnant and going to tell him the truth. She told them about his laughter, about being thrown out of his office, about the lawyers and the threats, and the absolute certainty he had that she was lying. She told them about the shelter, about the diner, about Beatrice, about giving birth alone in a rural hospital with no family present. She told them about the years of working multiple jobs, about teaching herself to code while they slept, about building Bloom Technologies specifically to compete with the man who tried to destroy her. She told them that Charles Summers was their biological father, but she had never told them about him because he didn't deserve the space in their lives, because he had proven through his actions that he wasn't someone who could be trusted with their hearts, because she needed them to grow up knowing their worth wasn't dependent on whether he chose to believe they existed. Linda expected questions, tears, confusion, anger. She expected her daughters to feel betrayed by the lie she had told them about their father being dead. She expected them to struggle with the knowledge that they had a living father who was wealthy and powerful but hadn't wanted them. Instead, Violet said something that broke Linda's heart and healed it at the same time. "I'm glad he wasn't there," Violet said, her voice steady and clear. "If he had been in our lives, would you have become the person who built Bloom Technologies? Would you have taught us that our strength comes from ourselves and not from who stays or leaves? Would we have learned what you taught us about surviving impossible things and still becoming extraordinary?" Iris nodded in agreement, reaching over to take her sister's hand. "I don't need a father who had to be forced to care about us. I don't need someone who only wants us now because he finally realized we exist. We have you. And you've always been enough. You've been everything." Linda couldn't hold back tears anymore, couldn't maintain the composure she usually kept so carefully intact. She pulled both daughters into an embrace, holding them while she cried for all the years she had carried the weight of their rejection alone, for all the time she had worried that not having a father would damage them, for all the fear that someday they would resent her for the choices she made. "I love you both so much," Linda whispered into their hair. "Everything I built, everything I became, all of it was for you, to prove that his rejection couldn't break us, to show you that you come from strength even if half your DNA came from someone weak." They sat together for a long time, processing the truth, until finally Iris pulled back and asked the question Linda had been dreading. "Does he want to know us now?" Linda nodded slowly. "Yes. He's been trying to contact us since the summit. He sent gifts that I returned. He's demanded meetings that I refused. He showed up at your school tonight because he couldn't respect the boundaries I set. He wants a relationship with you, but he doesn't understand that wanting something doesn't mean you deserve it." "Do we have to meet him?" Violet asked, and her voice held a note of anxiety that made Linda's protective instincts flare. "No," Linda said firmly. "You never have to meet him if you don't want to. You never have to forgive him or give him a chance or let him be part of your lives. That choice is entirely yours, and whatever you decide, I will support it completely. He doesn't get to force his way into our family just because he finally realized what he lost." The twins looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that siblings who were close often shared, communicating in glances and tiny facial expressions that no one else could interpret. Finally, they turned back to Linda with a decision. "We want to meet him," Iris said. "Once, just to see for ourselves who he is. Not because we want a father or because we're ready to forgive him. We want to understand where we came from. We want to look at him and know that he's just a man who made terrible choices, not a mystery or a villain or someone important enough to define us." "We want to demystify him," Violet added. using vocabulary that showed how mature they had become. Right now, he's this huge unknown thing that might have power over us because we don't understand him. If we meet him once on our terms, then he becomes real instead of imaginary. Then we can decide if he's worth knowing, and we'll make that decision based on who he actually is, not who we imagine he might be. Linda looked at her daughters with overwhelming pride, understanding that they were handling this revelation with more emotional intelligence than most adults could manage. They weren't asking to meet Charles because they needed him. They were asking to meet him so they could take away his power to haunt their imagination. Okay, Linda agreed, but it happens on our terms, in our home, with me present. He doesn't get to take you somewhere alone. He doesn't get to bring gifts or money or try to impress you with his wealth. He meets the real you, and you meet the real him. And if he can't accept those conditions, then he doesn't get to meet you at all. Over the next several days, Linda set conditions for the meeting that were designed to test whether Charles could respect boundaries, even when they were uncomfortable for him. She sent a message through lawyers detailing exactly what would be allowed. 1 hour in Linda's home, with her present throughout. No gifts, no attempts to take the twins anywhere. No promises about future relationships, no trying to buy their affection with offers of money or opportunities. If Charles violated any of these conditions, the meeting would end immediately, and he would never get another chance. Linda half expected Charles to refuse the conditions or to try to negotiate for something more comfortable for him. Instead, he agreed immediately to every single term without attempting to change anything. His lawyer sent back a simple message. Charles would be there at the specified time, would follow all conditions exactly as stated, and was grateful for the opportunity, regardless of the restrictions. The day of the meeting arrived, and Linda spent the morning preparing her daughters for what they would experience. She explained that Charles would probably try to charm them, that he was skilled at making people like him when he wanted to, that they shouldn't mistake his polished presentation for genuine change or growth. She reminded them that they were in control of this interaction, that they could end it at any time if they felt uncomfortable, that meeting him once didn't obligate them to anything in the future. When the doorbell rang at exactly the appointed time, Linda answered it to find Charles standing on her porch, looking more humble than she had ever seen him. He wore simple clothes, no designer labels visible, no expensive watch or other displays of wealth. His eyes were red-rimmed as if he hadn't slept well in days, and he held nothing in his hands because Linda had forbidden gifts. "Thank you for this," Charles said quietly, and Linda heard genuine gratitude in his voice mixed with fear that this might be his only chance. Linda didn't respond, just stepped back to let him enter her home, the house she had bought with money she earned, filled with photos of her daughters growing up without him. She led him to the living room, where Violet and Iris sat on the couch, both girls watching Charles with expressions that were analytical rather than emotional, studying him the way they might study a problem that needed solving. What followed was not a reconciliation or a warm family reunion. It was an interview conducted by two 10-year-old girls who had learned from their mother how to ask questions that cut through bullshit and exposed truth. Chapter 9. The Meeting Where Nothing is Forgiven. Charles sat in a chair facing the couch where Violet and Iris observed him with clinical assessment that made him realize these were not ordinary children who could be charmed with rehearsed apologies. Linda stood behind the couch with her hands on her daughter's shoulders, a physical reminder that she was the guardian of this interaction, that one wrong move would end everything. The living room felt smaller than it was, charged with tension that made even breathing feel significant. "Why did you laugh at our mother?" Violet asked. No preamble, just the question that mattered most, delivered with devastating directness. Charles had prepared answers that would explain his thinking, that would make his reaction seem understandable. But looking at Violet's face, seeing his own features reflected in this extraordinary girl watching him with prosecutorial intensity, all his prepared answers felt inadequate. "Because I was told years ago that I probably couldn't have children naturally," Charles said, choosing honesty. I had a childhood illness that damaged my fertility. When your mother told me she was pregnant, my first thought was that she must be lying because I believed my body couldn't do what she was claiming it had done. So you were wrong, and instead of investigating whether you might be wrong, you destroyed our mother's life, Violet said, a statement of fact Charles couldn't dispute. Yes, he admitted. I was arrogant enough to believe that my doctor's assessment was absolute truth. I was scared enough that I reacted with cruelty instead of curiosity. I made your mother pay for my fear. Why didn't you look for her after? Iris asked. Even if you thought she was lying at first, didn't you ever wonder later if maybe you made a mistake? Charles felt his throat close with shame because the honest answer revealed exactly how shallow his concern had been. No, he said, forcing himself to meet Iris's eyes. I convinced myself she wasn't telling the truth, and once I decided that, I didn't allow myself to question it. It was easier to believe she was a con artist than to face the possibility that I had done something unforgivable. I protected myself from guilt by refusing to think about what happened to you or your mother. The twins exchanged glances, filing away his words for later analysis. These were children who had learned critical thinking from a mother who had to think strategically to survive, and they weren't going to accept empty apologies. Are you sorry now because you feel guilty or because you want something from us? Violet asked, and the question was perfectly designed to expose his motivations. Both, Charles said, refusing to lie. I feel guilty about what I did to your mother. I'm devastated by what I missed in your lives. But I also desperately want a relationship with you because you're my daughters and I missed 10 years that I can never get back. Those feelings exist at the same time, and I can't pretend the guilt is pure or that my desire to know you isn't selfish. Iris studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. At least you're honest about that. Most adults would pretend they only wanted what was best for us. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, the twins asking questions that stripped away every defense Charles tried to construct. They asked why he thought money and power gave him the right to ignore boundaries. They asked what he would do if they decided they never wanted a relationship with him despite meeting him today. Charles answered every question honestly, even when the honesty made him look weak or cruel. He explained his obsession after the summit, admitted to hiring investigators, acknowledged that showing up at their school proved he still struggled to accept that his wants didn't override their needs. Linda watched without speaking, letting her daughters control the conversation, but Charles was acutely aware of her presence like a guardian who would not hesitate to end this meeting if he threatened her daughter's emotional safety. Finally, Violet asked the question that destroyed any hope Charles had harbored about easy reconciliation. If we hadn't been at that summit, if you never saw us, would you have ever wondered if Mom was telling the truth back then? Charles opened his mouth to say of course he would have eventually questioned his assumptions. But looking at Violet's face, seeing the intelligence in her expression, he knew she would detect any lie. So he gave her the truth he had been avoiding. No, he whispered. I wouldn't have. I would have gone my entire life believing your mother lied to me because accepting that truth would have required me to admit I was wrong about something fundamental. I would have been too proud to ever question it. The silence that followed was absolute. Violet and Iris looked at each other, having another silent twin conversation, and then Iris turned to Linda. Mom, why did you agree to let us meet him? Linda spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Because you asked to. Because I wanted you to see with your own eyes that he's not a mystery or a villain or a fairy tale. He's just a man who made terrible choices and has to live with the consequences. You needed to demystify him so he couldn't have power over your imagination anymore. Charles felt something break in his chest, understanding that this meeting wasn't the beginning of a relationship. It was closure for them, a way to take away his power to haunt their thoughts. They had met him not because they needed him, but because they needed to prove to themselves that they didn't need him at all. Can we talk privately for a minute? Violet asked Linda, and Linda nodded, leading both girls out of the living room and leaving Charles alone with his overwhelming sense of loss. When they returned, Iris spoke, delivering their decision with confidence that came from knowing their mother supported whatever choice they made. "We don't want a father," Iris said clearly. "We want the mother we have, and we don't need anything else. But we're willing to let you be in our lives in a very limited way, if you can prove you're capable of respecting boundaries and thinking about our needs instead of your wants. You don't get to call yourself our father. You don't get to make decisions about our lives. You don't get to show up at our school or our events unless we specifically invite you. If you can accept those terms and prove over time that you're not going to violate them, maybe eventually we'll be comfortable with you existing on the edges of our family." Charles wanted to argue, wanted to negotiate for more, but looking at his daughters' faces, seeing the absolute certainty in their expressions, he understood that arguing would only prove he hadn't learned anything. "I accept those terms," Charles said, his voice breaking. "Whatever you're willing to give me, however long it takes, I'll accept it and be grateful." Linda finally spoke again, and her words contained the truth that Charles would have to carry for the rest of his life. "You need to understand something, Charles. Violet and Iris agreed to this meeting and agreed to potentially let you have some limited role in their lives in the future. But I haven't forgiven you, and I never will. What you did to me isn't something that apologies can fix or that time can heal. You took the most vulnerable moment of my life and turned it into trauma that shaped everything that came after. My daughters are willing to give you a chance because they're extraordinary people with generous hearts. I'm allowing this only because it's what they want. But you and I will never have a relationship beyond whatever is necessary for coexisting in our daughters' lives. Is that clear?" "Yes," Charles whispered, understanding that this was the best outcome he could possibly hope for. "Thank you for this chance. I know I don't deserve it." "You don't," Linda agreed. "But my daughters deserve the chance to make their own decisions about you without my anger influencing them. So I'm giving them that choice. Don't make me regret it." Charles left Linda's house an hour after arriving, and the meeting had accomplished exactly what Linda and the twins intended. It had stripped away his power to be a mysterious, absent father, had forced him to face his own failures directly, had given Violet and Iris the information they needed to make informed decisions about whether he deserved any place in their lives. Charles understood that he had been given a test he would spend years trying to pass, with no guarantee that he would ever succeed, and that reality was far more painful than any revenge Linda could have designed. Chapter 10. The Year of Silence and the Reckoning. 3 days after the meeting, Charles received a letter from Linda, delivered through her attorney outlining one final test that would determine everything. The letter demanded 1 full year of complete silence, no contact with the twins through any method, no gifts, no letters, no attempts to see them, no using business connections to check on them. 1 year of proving he could respect boundaries without reward, without knowing whether he would ever get a second chance. If he violated this silence even once, the test would fail and he would never be given another opportunity. If he succeeded, Linda would contact him at the end of the year. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. Charles understood that this was both a punishment and a gift. Linda was ensuring that any relationship he eventually had with his daughters would be earned through sustained demonstration of growth rather than through persistence and resources. He wrote back agreeing to the terms, and then he began the hardest year of his life. The silence was excruciating. Charles was accustomed to action, to solving problems through force of will. Being forced to simply wait, to do nothing, to prove himself through absence, went against every instinct he had developed. But he had finally understood that his instincts had led him to destroy everything that mattered. Charles spent that year transforming himself and his company in ways that had nothing to do with winning back his daughters and everything to do with becoming someone who deserved them. He dismantled the aggressive legal team that had threatened Linda, replacing them with attorneys who specialized in employee rights. He created comprehensive family leave policies for all Summers Tech employees. He funded programs for single mothers, established scholarships for children raised in poverty, donated quietly to women's shelters. Most of these changes happened without publicity because Charles wasn't doing them for recognition. Journalists eventually noticed the changes and wrote articles questioning why Summers Tech had suddenly become the most family-friendly company in the technology sector, but Charles declined interviews. His board questioned the sudden shift. Charles simply told them that if they wanted him to continue as CEO, they would support the new policies, and if they couldn't, he would step down. The board agreed. The year passed with brutal slowness. Charles marked time by changes he implemented, by therapy sessions where he worked through his arrogance, by quiet donations to causes supporting people he had once dismissed. He watched Bloom Technologies from a distance, reading about Linda's continued success, and felt nothing but genuine pride in what she had accomplished despite him. On the exact anniversary of their meeting, Charles sent one letter to Linda. Not an apology or a plea, but a simple acknowledgement of truth written by someone who had spent a year learning humility. He wrote that he understood he couldn't undo the past, that his growth didn't erase her suffering, that even if he became a better person, she owed him nothing. He thanked her for the chance to meet their daughters once. He told her that if Violet and Iris ever wanted to contact him on their own terms, he would answer, but he wouldn't push or demand or expect anything beyond what they chose to give. He included his personal phone number and left the decision entirely in Linda's hands. Linda read the letter alone in her office late at night. She had spent the past year watching Charles from a distance too, tracking the changes at Summers Tech, hearing about his transformation, trying to determine whether he was performing growth or actually changing. The letter felt genuine in ways his previous attempts never had, and Linda found herself feeling something unexpected. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement that some people could grow even when they didn't deserve the chance. She showed the letter to Violet and Iris the next morning, letting them read it without influencing their response. The twins had spent the year living normally, thriving in school, occasionally mentioning Charles but not dwelling on him. They read their biological father's letter with the same analytical assessment they had used during their meeting. After discussion between themselves, Iris proposed something unexpected. "I have a piano recital next month," she said. "We could invite him to attend, not as a father, just as someone we're letting watch from a distance. We could test whether he follows boundaries now." Violet nodded. "It would be low stakes. He sits in the audience. He doesn't approach us afterward. If he can handle that without pushing for more, maybe he's actually capable of respecting what we need." Linda looked at her daughters with overwhelming pride, understanding that they were approaching this with wisdom beyond their years. They weren't offering Charles a relationship. They were offering him a test. Linda called Charles that afternoon. "Violet has a piano recital next month," she said without preamble. "You may attend if you follow these conditions. You sit in the back. You do not approach them before or after. You watch the performance and then you leave. If you violate any of these conditions, you will never be given another opportunity." "Yes," Charles said immediately. "Thank you. I'll follow every condition exactly." "This doesn't mean anything, except that my daughters are testing whether you've learned to respect boundaries," Linda clarified. "I understand," Charles said, and Linda heard genuine humility in his voice that had never been there before. The recital took place on a Saturday afternoon. Charles arrived early and sat in the back row as instructed, wearing simple clothes, carrying nothing except the weight of 10 years of regret. He watched parents fill the seats around him, saw families taking photos, and felt the acute pain of missing a decade of these moments. When Violet walked on stage, Charles felt tears start before she even sat at the piano. She was taller, more confident, moving with grace. She played a piece that was even more complex than before, her fingers moving across the keys with precision and emotion that made the entire audience hold their breath. Charles cried silently in the back row, understanding that he had missed years of seeing her develop this skill, years of being part of the journey that led to this moment. He had thrown away the chance to be her father in any meaningful sense, and sitting in that concert hall, watching from a distance, was both a gift and a punishment. After Violet's performance, after the audience applauded, Charles watched Linda sitting in the front row with Iris. Linda turned once, scanning the back until she found Charles's face, and their eyes met briefly. Linda nodded slightly, not forgiveness or warmth, but acknowledgement that Charles had followed instructions correctly for the first time in his life. When the recital ended, Charles waited until the auditorium had mostly cleared before standing to leave. He made no attempt to approach Violet or Iris, simply left as instructed. But as he walked through the lobby toward the exit, he saw the twins standing with Linda near the door. He started to walk past them without stopping, but Violet's voice stopped him. "You can come to my next recital if you want," she said, not turning to look at him. "Same rules." Charles felt his throat close completely. "Thank you," he managed to say, and then he left before he could say anything else that might violate the boundaries. Linda watched Charles walk away, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition that Charles had spent a year proving he could put their daughter's needs above his own desires, that he could follow boundaries even when painful. She turned to Violet and Iris, both watching their biological father disappear into the parking lot. "How do you feel about him?" The twins considered the question seriously. "I don't love him," Violet said slowly. "I don't feel anything like what I imagine children feel for their fathers, but I don't hate him either. He's just someone who exists on the edges of our life, someone who made terrible mistakes but seems to be trying to do better. I can let him watch from a distance without it meaning anything more than that." "I feel the same," Iris agreed. "He's not our dad. You're our parent. He's just the person whose DNA we carry. Maybe someday that will mean something different, but right now, this is all I want from him. He can exist in the background of our lives, but he doesn't get to be central. That place is yours." Linda pulled both daughters into an embrace. She had spent 10 years building a life where Charles Summers was irrelevant to their happiness and success, and her daughters had just confirmed that she succeeded completely. They didn't need him. They weren't damaged by his absence. They had grown into extraordinary people who understood that love was earned through presence and sacrifice, not demanded through biology. Charles Summers spent a decade building a technology empire, but Linda Lewis spent a decade building something far more valuable. She built a life where his approval was completely irrelevant, where his acknowledgement added nothing to her daughter's worth, where his presence in their lives was a privilege he had to earn rather than a right he could claim through DNA. 10 years after Charles Summers laughed at Linda Lewis, he finally understood that some sounds echo forever, but this time the echo was his daughter's voices at events he was allowed to attend but never belonged to, close enough to see what he'd lost, too far away to ever reclaim it. And Linda had built that exact distance into the architecture of their lives, with the precision of someone who knew that the cruelest mercy was letting him watch the family he destroyed thrive without needing him at all.